Really quickly, the only other thing I have to say before we get to the week 10 preview, make sure you're subscribed, share with a friend. If you can leave a rating and review, that would help. And also find us on YouTube, College Football Betting with Aaron Torres on YouTube. With that said, let's get to the two mega games this weekend. And they are huge, right? We'll start with, I think, probably the bigger one. Now, the College Football Playoff Committee screwed things up for everybody. According to the AP poll, we were supposed to get 1 versus 2, Georgia versus Tennessee. The College Football Playoff Committee does have Tennessee at number 1, but Georgia at number 3. So it is number 1 Tennessee at number 3 Georgia. The point spread, I'll tell you, it's fascinating. All of the money coming in on Tennessee. This line opened at 11.5 in the Betfred Sportsbook. It was at 8.5 as of Thursday or Wednesday night. Thursday morning, as I started prepping my notes for this show, it's down to 8. All of the money coming in on Tennessee. I saw Dave Purdom from ESPN said 90% of bets across Las Vegas are coming in on Tennessee. And I'll just tell you, in the bigger picture, what I think stands out to me, this is just a really strange game to try to handicap, right? Because normally, team goes on the road, team's an underdog. You try to make the argument why they can keep it close or they can at least win. I think there's a lot of people, I know there's a lot of people that think Tennessee is not only going to cover in this game, but win outright. These feel like 2 equals. I know the point spread is 8. I know all the money is coming in on Tennessee. I know that means historically you're going to want to back Georgia here, but I'm with most people in thinking that I just haven't seen anything from Tennessee that makes me think this is going to be a blowout. Now, in terms of the game itself, listen, it's going to be fascinating. We all know why this explosive Tennessee offense versus the Georgia defense, which probably across the board, not quite as good as last year, but they are really, really, really good. And I thought it was interesting as we discussed Tennessee, a couple things stand out. One, for obvious reasons, we get so excited talking about the offense and more specifically talking about the pass offense with Hendon Hooker. That's what tends to happen when you have the number 2 pass offense in college football, when you throw for 350 yards per game, when Hendon Hooker is your Heisman Trophy favorite here at the back half of the season in college football. What was interesting, though, Kirby Smart was asked about Tennessee earlier this week. You know what he talked about? He talked about the run game, and he said point blank, he said, look, as great as the pass game is, it's actually the run game which opens up everything for them. And this is something that we've talked about on this show. Everybody always thinks about these offensive savant head coaches, Josh Heupel obviously being the one we're talking about here, but Lincoln Riley. When Lincoln Riley's had his best teams, Oklahoma at the time ran the ball really well. As Oklahoma struggled to run the ball over the last few years, that's when you started to see struggles from Oklahoma. This year, Ole Miss, who's the number 1 rush offense in the SEC? Who's the number 3 rush offense behind only the 2 service academies, Air Force and Army? It's Ole Miss, and they're sitting at 8-1. And that's the thing about Tennessee that I don't think people appreciate. They are not only passing the ball all over the field, but they are running the ball really effectively as well. This is a top 25 run offense in college football right now. And that was what was impressive about that Kentucky game. In the Kentucky game, they rushed for over right around 200 yards, averaged about 4.5 yards per carry. And when they needed to chew the clock, when they needed to be in a scenario where they're not just throwing the ball all over the field, that's exactly what they did. So Kirby Smart said all week, this is a balanced offense. You know about the pass game, but the run game is just as good. And people don't give it credit, maybe not quite as good, but you get the point. They run the ball so well that it opens up the passing game as well. And to me, that becomes the question. Can this Georgia defense slow things down? I am worried that they can. First off, I don't think anybody can. And the over-under reflects that Vegas, that the Betfred Sportsbook, thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. Over-under is at 66 points for a Georgia game. That is absolutely unbelievable. And it speaks to the fact that even Betfred and the Betfred Sportsbook, by the way, it's up to 66.5 now, doesn't think that Georgia can slow Tennessee down. And I'm not sure they can either. Couple things that are interesting on Georgia. Now, we talked about it last week going into the Florida game. Do think they are probably better defensively. At the middle of the season, everybody was comparing them to last year, and you start to realize that's really dumb. That's really unfair to Georgia. We need to focus on this year's team because they just lost 1 million NFL draft picks and 5 first-round picks off that defense. Well, to Georgia's credit right now, they are better than I think a lot of people gave them credit for early in the year. Currently number 4 in college football in total defense. But the pass defense has fallen back a little bit. If you go back to last week against Florida, Georgia did break, Florida, the Gators, did break some big plays. And here's the other thing about Georgia that I think is really interesting, as Florida ended up with close to 400 yards of total offense last week against the Bulldogs. What's really interesting about this Georgia defense, I think we all think of just last year, explosive playmakers in the backfield. You know who's actually last in the SEC in sacks this season? It's the Georgia Bulldogs. You know who's ranked 104th nationally in tackles for loss? It's the Georgia Bulldogs. And so what's really interesting, I think we have this vision of what we think Georgia's defense is, maybe the same way we have a vision of what we think Tennessee's offense is, and that's just not who they are this year. Now, I don't claim to be X's and O's guy. I don't claim to be scheme guy. I don't have all the answers as to why Georgia has chosen to do things the way that they do, but I just bring it up because to me, what it speaks to is the fact that this is not the team. This is not the team that you think they are, especially on defense. They are not flying all over the field making plays. It feels as though they're more quote unquote base, if you will. And again, I don't claim to be scheme guy. And also on top of that, the other thing that I found interesting, pass defense has taken a tiny step back. This is a very young secondary. I thought The Athletic this week did a really good job. David Ubben from The Athletic, he talked to multiple coordinators and position coaches across the SEC, and they pointed out this secondary is really young. Keely Ringo's a junior, going to be a first-round pick this year. But outside of that, in the Georgia secondary, this is a team that is very young. Malachi Starks is a true freshman, other young players in that secondary, and I think we have seen it so far. It's not quite as good as it was last year. Now, I do think from the other perspective, we do have to talk a little bit about Georgia's offense. I'll give him credit, man. Listen, Stetson Bennett, all this guy does, and I've been critical of Stetson Bennett like everybody else, but all this guy does is just keep piling up points, keep piling up wins. And again, I don't think we think of Georgia's offense as explosive. We think of the defense as the explosive, playmakers all over the field. Georgia's offense, here's what they've done the last 3 weeks since that Missouri game where everybody freaked out. 42 points against Auburn, 55 against Vanderbilt, 42 against Florida. I will say they are going up against a Tennessee team that I think is much better on defense that people give them credit for. But this is an explosive offense. You look at what they did last week. You look at over 500 yards of total offense, and the question becomes, can a Tennessee defense, which I think is probably better than people give it credit for, can they slow down the Georgia offense? And I do think they can. The thing with Tennessee, it's so interesting, right? And we talked about this last week throughout this show, is that I think at this point in the year, we're 10 weeks in, everybody's playing their 9th game, played 8 games so far. Everybody wants to default to season totals in terms of stats, in terms of like, this is the 8th ranked run offense. This is the 9th ranked run defense. Well, here's the thing. Sometimes you have to kind of separate because a team is different now than they were at this time, in September or even early October. And so with the Tennessee defense, I think it's easy to look at the stats and say, they give up a lot of points. They give up a lot of yards. They basically gave up all their yards in 2 games. One was against Alabama. Oh my goodness. Bryce Young is superhuman Heisman Trophy winner. He should probably be the number 1 pick, and he was awesome. The other game was a bad performance against Florida, where Anthony Richardson was just otherworldly, where Anthony Richardson played the best game of his career. Look at what they've done to everybody else. 13 points LSU scored at home against this Florida team, against this Tennessee team. Kentucky had 205 yards of total offense, 3 turnovers, 3 interceptions for Will Levis last week against this Tennessee defense, held them to 6 points. If you watch that game, Kentucky's offense looked hopeless against this Tennessee defense. So the Tennessee defense, to me, is probably a little bit better than we give it credit for. The Georgia defense is probably a little bit worse than we give it credit for. And so with it, I'm ready to just say this. My official Betfred boosted pick of the week is Tennessee +8 against Georgia. That will be available in the Betfred Sportsbook on Friday, but that's my best bet of the weekend. I just look at this game. I don't see the scenario where Georgia blows Tennessee out. Now, could they go score for score? In theory, make enough stops, get a win? Maybe. I don't know if that happens, though. I think Tennessee wins, but I certainly